Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Nightlight. Your host tonight, Mark Eddy, has an amazing guest with him. He's got Dennis Stone on with him, who is the owner of American Stonehenge. So sit back and prepare to be educated in a way that the books in America don't, the history books certainly don't teach you, and become enlightened slightly. So welcome to the show, Mark. Good to have you again.
Yeah. Was this like show 11 or 12 now?
I stopped counting.
Yeah, it's like the last two times in 11 months I've had Dennis as a guest. I got fired after each show, so I'm a little hesitant as we get closer to 12:01 and the English Robo Babe cuts us off, but hopefully there'll be a show 13 or whatever is lined up for tomorrow. But that's and we have and you had a great show last night to kick off our what you say quadrilogy of premier. Prehistoric experts.
Yes, I did. David Collis was amazing. I got to have him back on again.
Yeah, he'll be with us as part of our Christmas show. What day is it?
11th?
December 11th. Right. That's our Christmas show to the listeners. That's going to be a really fun one. He's only part of the panel we have to discuss the reason for the season.
It's going to be fun.
Yep. And
I'm excited about. I'm excited about Dennis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dennis. We have Jason, Gerald tomorrow night. Probably going to be touching on giants, but I think he's gotten wound up about some other topics, and then he has a new article coming out in Ancient American magazine. So that we're going to have a whole bunch of Adina and Hopewell stuff, hidden history going on. Around the mainstream people hiding history tomorrow night, and David Brody on he'll be with you on Sunday. So
yes.
It's like all four guests for this. Is quadrilogy a word?
It is now.
Okay. All right. So we.
I think you've coined a phrase.
Okay, yeah, maybe, hopefully I'll start getting paid for it. But
don't quit your day job.
but yeah, it's like all four of those researchers got their starts with us, one way or another before they even made it to coast to coast.
So we're a good stepping stone.
Yeah.
We're a good stepping stone.
Yeah. So that's a good segue into bringing Dennis on. So it's you may have remember hearing Dennis on a few years ago with Barbara, and he had many years as a airline pilot, but he's best known as the owner of southeastern New Hampshire's America's Stonehenge. And let's see, he who engineered this 4,000-year-old archaeological site. Dennis has been researching it for basically his entire life. You may have seen him on Scott Walter's America Unearthed as they evaluated the summer solstice of 2014 or somewhere around there. So welcome, Dennis. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thank you, Barbara and Mark, for having me on and your listeners tonight. Doing pretty good.
Yeah, good. What year did you film the show with Scott? Was that 2013, 2014?
The actual shooting was 2012, 6 years ago, and then it aired, I think, in January of 13. So it's hard to believe it was 6 years ago. Yeah, I keep thinking it's like 3 years ago, but it was 2012.
Wow, I didn't realize it was that long ago either. Okay, so Dennis, we'll talk about the history of your property in a little bit, but maybe start off by talking about some of the more recent activities going on at the America's Stonehenge and what you've been doing. Recently, just this past weekend, you spoke at a NERA meeting. Let's talk about that, and what are some of the New England researchers discovering? What's the talk of the town up in your area?
Well, we did have the fall meeting of the New England Antiquities Research Association. They held their meeting over in Nashua for Friday and Saturday, and then their field trip was at our place. And they hadn't been over there for about 4 years. The group was formed by my dad back in 1964, so they're almost up on the 55th anniversary. So we're certainly very, very excited to have him and host him at our site. And he spent pretty much all Sunday there, and I got a chance to show him some of our finds that we have made in the last couple of years since I retired from flying. I did that for about 35 years as an airline pilot. And now I have more time on my hands in the last couple of years. So we have found quite a few things. My dad passed away about 9 years ago, just before Christmas of 2009. I think he'd be quite surprised to see some of the things that we have found. And so when Nero was up there, we took him on about a 4 or 5 hour tour of some of these finds. We didn't cover the entire hill, but we saw a lot of the different features that were quite surprising to us. Things such as what we call Serpent Walls, and we think we have about 12 of these, and they range from the wall would range about 30 feet up to about, the longest one we believe right now is about 2,550 feet in length. And then the other ones are kind of in between, averaging usually around 100 feet in length, and they have a head, they have a body, and then they'll have a tail, and some other features in the wall, too, that makes them kind of very, very interesting. A couple of these features in the walls are what we call spirit windows, These are linteled holes in the wall, and they've been designed specifically, I should say intentionally. They don't look like they're just where a rock fell out of the wall. They have beautiful lintel stones and stones on each side that support the lintel. And they're usually near the ground. In fact, one of them that I found had 4 of these windows adjacent to each other. And they make no sense if you look at a farmer's wall. They're usually kind of straight or linear. They do curve sometimes, made out of a lot of field stones. And that was one of the reasons they built the walls, is to get rid of all these field stones, especially if they were plowing a field. Another thing is for boundary or stock fence. But New England is just filled with stone walls built during the historic period, but we think we have prehistoric walls. And one thing my dad noted way back when he first began researching the site in the 1950s, he noticed that the walls had a lot of big slabs of stone in them. And so he felt at the time, and I think we've kind of proven he was correct, that these slabs were part of the bedrock, that somebody intentionally split from the bedrock, possibly shaped, and then they stood them up in the walls. Later in the 1960s, we began the astronomical research, and we found that some of these are aligned with the sun, moon, and stars. They're actually astronomical alignment markers. There's also a lot of, just big slabs stood up on the side, kind of running with the wall. We call them orthostats. And some of these are, multi-ton stones, and they must have had a purpose to them. They look beautiful on the wall. They're very artistic, but their actual meaning has kind of been lost to time. Hopefully someday we'll have a better idea why they did that. And so the other thing, too, we've been finding things like what we think is a megalithic yard on the site. And in the 1970s, I made a diorama while I was in college of the hilltop. And when we were up there measuring some features on the site and some of the walls surrounding it, we kind of came upon what we already were aware of called the megalithic yard. It's 32.64 inches or 2.73 feet, and it's found throughout megalithic sites in Europe. And we were aware of that. We didn't know if we had it at our site. But when we started doing some measurement, we found that these units fit nicely into some of the stonework. But inches, feet, and yards, these imperial measurements that we use over here, don't fit. And this was recognized back in the 1930s by one of our first researchers, Oscar Whitney from MIT. He was an engineer. He put a plane table up on the site, and he said every inch of the site, and he had cross-sections, profile, and plan views, and we still have all those records today. And one of his comments was, whoever built the site either didn't give a damn about linear measurements and knew nothing about them, because I've looked at every inch of the site, and our measuring system does not, conform to, or the site does not conform to our measuring system. So that's another thing we found up there. One of the things we noticed on our walls more recently in the last 2 years or so is that the wall will go to one of these large glacial boulders, and we've seen that before, but what we didn't notice, it seems like the wall will take off in a different direction after that boulder, and it will go to another large boulder, and then it will go off into a different direction to another boulder. And my wife, she mentioned something about rosary bead walls. So, once you see it, it's like, oh, wow. And the wall, it goes in these big turns deliberately to go to these boulders, kind of out of its way, if you will. If I was a farmer, I might use one rock for a reference and run a wall to it, but to go way out of the way, left or right, to another one, and then back a different direction, zigzagging all over the place. And that's what our walls do. So these are some of the most recent finds, in the last, I'd say, 2.5 years or so.
Okay, Dennis, you sent me some photos of the spirit windows. What purpose did they serve?
It's where the wind would blow, I think, through these windows. And people have been aware of this a little bit at other sites, particularly up in Vermont and in Massachusetts and possibly Connecticut. And this goes back into the 70s and 80s. And there was a book put out in 1989, Manitou by Byron Dix and James Mayberg Jr., two very interesting gentlemen. And the book came out, and I read it back in the very, very early 90s or late 89 when it came out. And then I read it again several years later. And I just read it this year again, because when I read it those times, I didn't pay much attention, but it mentions in that book that there are in Vermont and Massachusetts and I believe in Connecticut in Massachusetts, is on Martha's Vineyard. They have these little, what they call spirit windows or soul holes. And they're in Vermont, they're in Connecticut, like I mentioned. And they also mentioned Serpentine Walls, too. And since we were not aware of any of these features at our site, we thought, I just didn't pay a lot of attention to those two particular items, They just, since we didn't have them at our site that I knew of, kind of just read through the paragraphs. So that's interesting, and kept on reading. And some of the features, remind me of our site, especially the astronomical alignments and some of the inscriptions found up in Vermont, particularly. That's where most of the inscriptions in New England are found, but not the walls that are shaped like a serpent or the spirit holes. I did have a radio show 2 months ago with a doctor, and she does a show about medicine and health, but she's kind of branching out a little bit into ancient sites, astronomy, archaeoastronomy, that kind of thing. And we had about a 2-hour talk, and I mentioned that. She goes, she was a nurse in Texas before she came as a doctor, and she worked at a hospital. It was a Catholic hospital, and she had a key to lock the window and unlock the window so they can open it, close it, let fresh air in, and then lock it for security. She goes, sometimes when the family was there and the patient would pass, they would ask me to open the window and let the spirit go out the window, So it might be kind of a modern-day kind of idea of the same kind of thing, letting the spirit pass through the window. So we don't have any other idea what these things could be used for, because on a farm, unless you wanted squirrels to run underneath them or chipmunks, or a snake to go through it, there'd be no reason to take all this effort. And these stones that are lintels were once part of the bedrock. They're flat or what we call fractured rocks. They had to be peeled off the bedrock specifically for that purpose, I guess.
And you were finding that this pattern is going all across New England.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I think not Stonehenge, Connecticut. I'm not sure how Barbara lives from there, but that became known to us only 2 years ago at the fall meeting in NERA. And the meeting was in Groton, Connecticut. My wife and I went to that. It's one of the first ones I attended after I retired, and it was a book written by a gentleman, and it was called Ceremonial Stonework. And I thought it was all of New England because there's so many. There's like 200-something pictures, and then you read it a little closer, and it's like 8,000 different features. I suppose it's got to be New England, or Greater New England. And then as you read it, you realize it's just one town of North Stonington, a 35,000-acre area with 8,000 features, and it has 25 stone chambers that look like some of the ones at America's Stonehenge. It has over 400 serpentine walls, and that's the first time I really saw that after finding my first serpentine walls at our site. I had found the first ones in the spring of 2016, and this book came out in the fall, right around the time of the NERA meeting, 6 months later. And I'm like opening up, and going, oh my gosh, this is the same thing we have. I was kind of shocked almost when I saw that. It kind of got dizzy for a minute, like, wow. And then you flip through it and you find the windows, and they got the windows down there too, and they look
Dennis,
like our windows, Mm-hmm.
Dennis, are the serpentine ones? Patrick and I took pictures of several stone walls in the area that were, we called them zigzag, but they could have been called serpentine as well.
Right, yeah.
Or would there be a difference?
The ones in North Stonehenge is a great example. They have about 400 of them, and the statistics are that they run from about 30 feet in length, which is about the length of the first one I found in the spring of 2016, and ours has a head, a body, and a tail, and it runs straight, and it's on kind of an outcropping of bedrock. And that's two of the ones down in Stonington, and they run up to 300 feet, and the average is about 100. Most of them are linear, in other words, kind of straight. There's a few that are rectilinear with a 90-degree turn to the head. And in fact, during the I was at the meeting on Saturday, I spoke, and some of the pictures shown were of actual snakes, and they'll have the head twisted 90 degrees to the bottom, to the body, and that's just what some of these walls look like, a 90-degree bend in the head. But then they showed some of the curved ones. So we have, I think, 2 curved or curvilinear ones at our site. Most of them are linear, and some are rectilinear. And that's kind of true of North Stonington. And if you go into Rhode Island, right across the border there, most of those are curved. So there's a little bit difference on the Rhode Island side. It's funny, right on the state border you cross it, and it's a slightly different shaped to these. Most of them are curved instead of straight like the ones in North Stonington. But they're in Vermont too, and it's not just a New England phenomena, if you will. After the gentleman spoke about his book, Ceremonial Stonework, an hour later, a lady from eastern Colorado spoke by Skype with her two male colleagues, and she's showing the same kind of stonework that we have in New England, particularly in North Stonington and at our site, of cairns, cairn fields, which are multiple cairns, and then something I wasn't too familiar with is what they call a chambered cairn. It's actually like a chamber inside the cairn, tiny little chamber that's almost useless unless it's something that's ceremonial where you place an offering or something. She's got the same thing in Colorado, and then she gets into her standing stones, and then she shows some of her Serpentine Walls, and it's like one of them looks just like the exact triangular head as we have at, one of our 12 walls, one of our 12 Serpentine Walls. And my wife and I kind of sat up and we saw that picture, and I wish I could have talked to her, but she's 2,000 miles away. So they may be spread across the country. So I would look at that zigzag wall again a little closer to see if it has kind of either a stacked head, which is a bunch of stones, stacked higher, which kind of represents a head. It's a little higher than the body, or some sort of a boulder, generally maybe triangular shaped or diamond shaped. Sometimes they're block-headed, but they usually have, it's very obvious. It has a head and it has a body, and it goes to a tail. Some of these, and one of ours at our site, actually has a bulge in the middle of it. The bulge in ours is a great big boulder. We think not only does it have the body and the tail, but the big boulder about halfway down might be its prey going through its system after it ate it.
Wow.
It's like the tail, and you can have your disbelievers, your believers, or people sitting on the fence, but if you look at it, it's like, and it repeats that pattern over and over and over again. And what is that? What is a serpent? I mean, it's in the Adam and Eve, in the Bible. It's St. Patty driving out the serpents. And also, it's Draco the dragon, the constellation. And some people say, as above, so below. They're bringing down some of these constellations and putting them on the earth, And the interesting thing about Draco is one of the stars is Thuban, Alpha Draconis. And 4,000 years ago, that was our pole star. So if the ancients were looking at, true north, and they were looking at night, they'd see that Draco was revolving around its star Thuban. And it might have been quite significant to these ancient people, because some people thought the North Pole was a place of where your spirit may pass. In some cultures, it was where heaven was. I think the Egyptians kind of looked at the bar or the car heading in that direction too, towards the pole star. Today it's Polaris. 4,000 years ago, and for several centuries it was the pole star.
And Dennis, are these Serpentine Walls you're talking about? Have they been dated, to being contemporary with the main site that people can see on your website where all the stone chambers are, or are they later additions to the property? Just want to know if you've been able to get a carbon date on when these walls could have been built.
That's a great question, Mark. Honestly, we don't know the answer to that, except that some of these Serpentine Walls are, one of them, the 2,550-footer, does start at what we call the watch house, with a large glacial rock with a chamber attached to it. And when you look at it walking up to the whole thing, and it's pretty big, it looks like the serpent head. And then behind it, we only recognized this a little over 2 years ago, the wall undulates. It goes up and down these beautiful humps. And that wall continues, and it actually goes through every astronomical sunrise and sunset, moonrise and moonset, and a star alignment with, Thuban, the North Star. So we're not really sure, but those astronomical alignments, when they surveyed them starting in 1973 through 77 for the first phase of our survey, we sent that data to the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics in Cambridge, Mass. The results came back that if these alignments were used for astronomical purposes, they would work about 1800 BC plus minus about 200 years, because the Earth's tilt is very slowly changing. The solstices, the lunar standstills, what we call the cross-quarter days will be off today. The equinox still works. The true north alignment still aligns with the polar axis of the Earth, and above it is Polaris. And due to precession, if you go back 4,000 years ago, like I mentioned with Thuban, the North Stone, however, was the subject of an excavation back in 1989 through 1991 by at that time, the president of the New Hampshire Archaeological Society. She took 3 years working on that with a couple of assistants. Found a fire pit above the base of the stone, and the fire pit dated that was dated to 650 AD, so about 1,400 years ago. And what it showed was that the stone was already standing there, and then the fire pit was built later. It wasn't the other way around. It wasn't like somebody, like the Paddy family, we can get into the Paddies, during the 18 and 1900s, the Paddy family owned the hill. Like, some skeptics think they built the whole site. That's one theory, but it doesn't carry much weight. But so if they had stood that stone up, you would have dug down through the layers of soil we call strata, and you would have put the stone in, backfilled it, and all those layers, those color bands would have been destroyed by backfilling, and the fire pit would have been wiped out. So the stone was stood up first, and it sits. They went right down to the bottom of the stone during the excavation over those 89 through 91, and they found it was sitting kind of in a little bit of a crevice in the bedrock, which helped to kind of hold it upright, if you will. And then they put some cobbles around it to help support it, and they probably backfilled. And then very slowly the rest of the soil accumulated over time, and then somebody around 1,400 years ago built a fire. So we know the stone was standing there at least 1,400 years. So back to your question, what we'd like to do, we haven't dated all the walls, other than they work astronomically with the stones that are kind of part of the wall, going back 4,000 years, and we have a fire pit that shows that the North Stone was already standing there 1,400 years ago. We would like to do new technology. One of them's optically stimulated luminescence, OSL, and they take cores of soil, they send it out to a laboratory, we do all this cleaning with the soil, and then they hit it with lasers, and they can tell you how long that soil's been sitting there without seeing the light of day. So you'll hopefully have several inches of soil, deeper the better, and you get to the bottom of it, and hopefully it's never been disturbed by humans, animals, or anything. And you take that and you send that core out, then you take some baseline cores and you send it to a laboratory, and then you'll get your results back of how long that dirt's been sitting next to the wall. And we have thousands and thousands of feet of walls, including those Serpentine Walls and the standing stones. So this is something we would like to do, but it's very, very expensive. They did a chamber down in Massachusetts that was supposed to be built just a couple hundred years ago by, basically we call them skeptics, but the mainstream, it's just a colonial root cellar or post-colonial root cellar. And they did testing about 7 years ago on it. A couple of our researchers were there when they did it. And the medium date that came back on it, showing that when it was standing there, not when it was built, but it was already standing there. I believe the medium date, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, was about 1450 AD. It was even before Columbus's time. So it wasn't 200 or 300 or 400 years old. It was older than that, So I'd like to do that at our site. It does take a lot of money, and you have the right people that can conduct taking the probe, the soil probes, and then send it to the laboratory and have it done.
Okay, and a lot of people are using drones for larger sites. People can get into helicopters. Hopefully, we could discuss that in one of the books that we hope to be reviewing soon. It has a chapter on the aerial photography around Cahokia, but those types of technologies are available to help you and other people make sense of like the bird's eye view of a site and what everything may mean when you're looking straight down on it, give you some new insights. but what are some other new technologies that are available? Like you've also talked about some like a liquid that you can put into cracks. How does that test work?
Yeah, that is called protein analysis, and I became aware of it, I believe, through the New Hampshire Archaeological Society's their newsletter or bulletin that I get. My dad was a member of that group too since I believe the early 1960s. He was one of the members of the group, and one of my uncles was a member of that group too, and I used to go to some of the digs. But yeah, I think it's a fairly new test, and again, I don't know the cost of that. Usually one of the problems is the cost. These can get very expensive. But if it was a arrow point or any kind of like a spear point or stone knife or an axe, anything that could have like a microfissure in it, including like even possibly our sacrificial table if it was used for that purpose. Our table's about 9 feet by about 6 feet. It's shaped like a bell, and it has a large, we used to say rectangular groove, but it's trapezoid. It's about 9 inches approximately shorter or narrower at the top than it is at the bottom. And it's a deep groove and it has a runnel on it. But the table does have a lot of little cracks in it. I remember Scott Walters talking about the weathering on the stone, and it appeared to him that the stone had been there for not just a couple hundred years, but far longer than that because of the amount of wear and tear on the surface of the rock. And as a kid, I was up there, as a guide, and people would say, "Do you think they could test it and see if there's blood on it?" Because our answer usually was, "Well, we don't know, but if it's been exposed to the elements for thousands of years, possibly." Maybe all that evidence has been washed away, and some of the top of the layers of the, small amount of the top surface is worn away too. But if it has a fissure in it that blood get into, thousands of years ago that protected it, they can extract that. And I believe they can go back around 10,000 years with this technology, and then they can identify whether it was human or animal, and they can even tell you the type of animal. I'm not sure if they can tell you, like what type of person it was, necessarily. Maybe they can. But they just say the type of animal they could identify, so I assume they can tell us something about the person too, if in fact that's what it was. So that's kind of neat. Again, it's called protein analysis, and I don't know what laboratories do this and who's qualified to extract that, and then you have to be careful you don't spend a lot of money on a crack that's only like 100 or 200 years old, if in fact the stone is 4,000 years old, You might be actually going into something that was only a couple hundred years ago, and, you're not going to, you need to do is find a crack that's thousands of years old, if in fact any kind of like fluid like blood got on it and went into this little crack. So that's another piece of neat technology that's around today and then it kind of gives you an answer, more than just a guess.
Okay, and you just mentioned the importance of the labs doing the test, and you want to do submit the right sample, and hopefully it's going to a reputable lab. But the date of the earliest date of America's Stonehenge is based on a carbon sample, and you've actually had many more carbon 14 tests done from the all across the property. You've had all kinds of different tests run on things, and there are a number of time periods. So the hill's been occupied for or utilized for thousands of years. But you have samples of the letters you've received from the labs on display at the visitor center. But what's the lab you've been dealing with for all these tests that you've been submitting to them?
the first radiocarbon dating was done, I believe, 1966, and then we did 67, 68, I think there was another test. I got all the reports as well as you mentioned, on the display cases. We have some of the reports so people can look at them as they come in, and there's an explanation of what radiocarbon-14 dating is all about. And the test went through the 70s. The last ones we did were in the 1990s, and the first ones were all radiocarbon-14, standard testing, and they were done by Geochrome Laboratories out of Cambridge, Mass. And I understand, looking their name up last year, I was just seeing if they were still around because we haven't dealt with them in a couple decades. They are still around, and they're in, I believe, I think they moved up towards Lowell, Massachusetts area, so they've moved from their original headquarters. The laboratories actually moved. And my dad was, my dad knew Harold Kruger. He met him because of the datings over the several years of datings. But Harold Kruger was the gentleman that was ahead of the whole thing. But in the 90s, we took we did several different carbon datings in the 1990s, and 3 of them were done by Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in Woods Hole, Mass. And the calibration was done out at the University of Washington, and those final reports are on the display for the public too. And so those were done. They call them mass accelerator spectrometry, or MAS tests. I think in those you only need like 1/2000th of samples. So you don't have to destroy a big piece of an artifact to get it. And it's actually counting atoms, I guess, the actual atoms themselves, according to the physicists that I talked to, rather than just measuring like with a very fancy Geiger counter the radiation. So it's more accurate. You don't have to destroy as much mass to do it. And so those last 3 were done by Woods Hole versus Geochrome Laboratories. And the neat thing is another type of testing come along is the optically stimulated luminescence, as I mentioned. So you don't really need charcoal. You do with carbon-14. You need something organic, bones, teeth, shell, wood, charcoal, for carbon dating. But with a OSL dating, and all you need is dirt, basically, as long as it's undisturbed and a certain depth of dirt. And dirt's everywhere, so the charcoal isn't necessarily everywhere. So we would like to look at that. Either one of them would be great, but I think the OSL might have more, because dirt is everywhere, it might have more potential testing the walls that you were referring to earlier, and even some of the chambers in what we call the main site, too, where they haven't been disturbed by anybody.
Okay, and in one of the guidebooks, you sell at your visitor center, you have reproductions of all the letters from the laboratories, and one of the write-ups of one of the samples says there was a charcoal taken from between wall stones of chamber XB. So if the charcoal was found, kind of like at the base of a built wall, from nearly 4,000 years ago. That was where you got the date, and there was also like a hammerstone found nearby, all at the same level.
Yeah, that was originally that area was the north side of the chamber. Hope we're on the same page. But the north side of the chamber in ruins. It's kind of we thought a rectangular structure. Again, we've been measuring it a little more closely and found it seems to be a trapezoidal shape. It's orientated north-south and basically east-west, and it has what looks like 2 windows, one on the north side on the wall, kind of up high, and the other one near the doorway where you enter, just to the left of the doorway. And the doorway is facing south, so as you're walking into it, you're walking north, and the windows on your lower left. And we just discovered in the last 3 years we were working on that project 3 years ago, again, getting into it and really looking at closely, and we're doing excavations, again, with the lady that was president of New Hampshire Archaeological Society. Now she's on the board and everything. She's been with us for almost 30 years. So we noticed that the walls, 3 of the walls, the corners, I should say, are actually corbelled. They have a slight, sloping inward curvature to them. It's kind of almost like an arch, but it's not quite. And it's an old technique used to bridge a distance so that when you put the roof on, it's kind of narrower at the top than it is at the bottom. You can use a smaller stone. But it's a very good way to build a wall. It's sturdy, but it's actually arched in, and we didn't know that. And then we went down and looked at a chamber that's similar to it, same orientation, has a window, a little bit smaller, and it also seems to have a trapezoidal floor plan. With all stone roof slabs in all these chambers, by the way. People aren't familiar with our site, and other sites in New England are like that too. But it seems to have that three corners, or have that core belling. When you first enter it, it's just a straight wall, and then it goes to the first corner in front of you, and then the other two corners, and they're all core belled. But in 1967, they excavated looking for the remains of a pine stump, and this was photographed by Malcolm Pearson back in 1936. It was looked at by William Goodwin and Roscoe Whitney, as well as Hugh Hecken from the Peabody Museum of Harvard University, and others. And they said, well, although Patty may have built all this stump is growing through this wall, and it's so decayed we can't do dendrochronology on it. We can't tree ring date it. But by its diameter and state of decay, they all kind of agreed. It estimated it back to in the 1600s. So in 30 years later, the stump's gone, but when they got down and they excavated into that wall, they found, and we got pictures of the actually extracting that root. I think it was James Woodall at the time, and NERA and his assistants were digging there, and they photographed it, fortunately, and they'd taken the root out, and it was sent to geochrome laboratories. The results came back. It was 1690 AD, plus or minus, I think, 50 years, if I recall. Put it back before what we call the Patty family, kind of proving the Pattys couldn't have built the whole thing, if you will. 1969, they continued their excavation in that area. And as they went down, I think they went down through several inches of sterile soil. It's like, oh boy, we got nothing. And finally, they struck charcoal, and I guess it was kind of like a charcoal scatter, possibly from a forest fire, but it helped to date that layer, the stratigraphic layer there, right up against the north wall. And they also found almost immediately, I guess, when they went just a little further down, stone tools. And as you mentioned, Mark, a hammer stone, I think a stone scraper, and there are a couple other stone tools found in there, as well as stone spallings. These are little flakes of stone you get when you shape stones, little flakes come off. And the technique is called percussion flaking. It's like shaping an arrowhead or a spear point on a much grander scale. And we can talk about that after. But 1970, and that charcoal was sent to geochrome, and the results came back that date was about 3,000 years old. 1971, they were still working on that excavation, and they found more charcoal from a different fire, and a little bit lower layer, I think. And they dated that to 4,000 years old, plus or minus about 250 years. As they get down further, they found the bedrock finally in the bottom of the wall. The wall was sitting on bedrock. What they noticed was that the bedrock had been quarried below all of this excavation activity. That whole area was quarried. So the first thing that happened is the original builders came in and they lifted out the bedrock. They used it for building material, roof slabs, wall stones, that kind of thing. And then they built a wall of the chamber in ruins. And then very gradually over time, little flakes of stone were left behind, charcoal was left behind, a hammer stone, a scraping stone, rubbing stone I think was found in there too. So stone tools were found in there, and then very slowly the soil builds up, and then we have another fire around 3,000 years ago, and then later, around 1690, a tree's growing through that chamber. So that's just one area of the site. I think we had 12 carbon datings, and those are 3 right there that we did out of the 12.
Okay, and Dennis, a lot of people like the you've mentioned the orthostats, touched on the corbelled ceilings, and people do talk about the corbelled ceilings do seem to be reminiscent of Maze Howe, or in the Orkney Islands in Scotland, or Newgrange in Ireland. But you and I have also spoken about the megalithic yard was also used as a standard unit of measurement in central archaic sites in Central America. Is there any evidence that people may have moved out of Mexico and eventually made their way to what's now New England? Is there any like bones that could be tested? You have the same unit of measurement on both sides of the Atlantic. I'm just wondering, what you think of that possibility.
Well, yeah. Well, bones in New England, basically, due to the acidity in the soil, they usually last a few hundred years. And if you find them older, maybe they're in clay or maybe in peat or something that helps to protect them. We have found some bones on our site. But I was just listening to one of the lectures at the NERA meeting, and the gentleman was doing it from, he was a professor at a college, and he was well-spoken, and he spoke for about 45 minutes or so, or maybe 40 minutes or so, and answering questions and everything. He mentioned, the flow out of from down south, and he mentioned that he had found that the Aztec language was prevalent not only in the Four Corner area of the United States, but also going further east up, I think he said into the Ohio Valley. He said Aztec language was the language of traders, people that were trading goods. He said, and I had never heard that before. I really sat up in my chair and listened to that part of it. And he did it by phone. He didn't do it by Skype, so you couldn't really talk to him. I mean, you could ask him some questions, but you couldn't get him aside later and just ask him a few more questions, just one-on-one kind of thing. But very fascinating, and he was very well read and everything, and he does excavations and everything, so he's a hand-on archaeologist, not just an armchair. But he said the Aztec language is found throughout the United States, and it was quite amazing to me. I don't know why it was, but I hadn't heard it. I guess that was the amazing part, probably. But I was aware, though, that the Mayans had a cultural influence going into Florida back when my son was born around 1989. We took a trip down there and we visited the Crystal River Mounds. And then we've been back there since. And the second time I was there, I guess you get more information. Next time you go, and you see more, I guess, and I picked up some of the books there and found out that they believe that because of the carvings in the rocks at Crystal River, and these are pyramids made out of shell. They're really magnificent, even after all these centuries of being weathered and, any damage done to them because of that, or people, and they were up and down the western coast, and there were ones on the eastern coast of Florida. A lot of them are underneath the high-rise hotels and buildings today and under highways, but fortunately the Crystal River Mounds is still there. And they say the Maya came across it all, and they are the other way around. And I thought it was for the Mayans coming up. It could be the other way around too, them Floridians heading into Mexico, into the Yucatan, and they were exchanging goods. So after that trip to Florida, not long after that, we went down to Cancun, and I visited Colville with the family, and I asked one of the guides down there. They were excellent, and I said, do you know that they say there's a cultural influence between here and the Crystal River Mound and in some of the other, there's many of them gone today, the pyramidal mounds in Florida? And he goes, oh, yes, we're well aware of that. And I said, I just found out about it, just recently. I had no clue because they don't teach this in school. But in the last year or so, I found out that the Mayans had a cultural influence near Chaco Canyon. And I was giving a tour of our site, and the lady spoke out. She goes, not only Chaco Canyon, but you go to some of the sites further north, I think towards Utah, and into Colorado, up in that area, Mesa Verde, or even further up there. The influence went up there too. So that coming out of the south to the north, I think that they've kind of proven that. And if you go to California on the Colorado River, you find the what they call the black geoglyphs, and anybody can Google that. And every time I show it to people at a museum or elsewhere, they're like, wow. And what they look like are the Nazca lines down in Peru, and there are 130 of them on the Colorado River. And around Blythe, I think there's a couple dozen. You just get further out, and you get the other, 130 in total. There's probably more they're going to find by drones and by satellite. I'm sure we'll find even more of these things, all that new technology. So that influence could have come out of even down in South America. Potatoes and corn and squash and beans, these things came out of, either South or Central America into past Mexico right into the United States. They made their way out of that area too. So that influence definitely came out of there. You mentioned the megalithic yard. It's 83 centimeters. And you sent me some information from a professor, I think from BYU, I think it was. Talking about 83 centimeters down in Teotihuacan, which I've been to. And when I was there with my dad, we never heard of any measuring system down there. Maybe we just weren't paying attention. But Poverty Point in Louisiana, Watkins Break in Louisiana, and I believe some of the ruins in Peru, and probably Chile, but and elsewhere. But it's 83 centimeters, and there's multiples of that. And then I did the conversion on my phone, and it comes out to 3264. It's a megalithic yard, So I had some skeptics say, well, Dr. Tom's megalithic yard's almost an arm's length, like our 36 inches in the imperial system. But, of course, the meter is close to that, too. It's 39, 37, but it's not based on an arm length. It's based on, 1/10 millionth of the distance from the equator to the North Pole or South Pole, almost, So the megalithic yard can be broken down into not just that length of 32. It's broken down into a half-inch, not our half-inch, but a megalithic half-inch, a megalithic inch, which is 1/40th of the megalithic yard, and then a fathom is a half a megalithic yard, and then a rod is a 2.5. Well, those aren't exactly all arm lengths or finger lengths or whatever. So, and I said, I don't think there's too much doubt about Tom's work. But this person was like, well, it probably could have just been a coincidence, And, well, I guess the meter was too, because that's about a 36-inch length too, So I don't believe that, but in the cubic, the Egyptian cubic's basically your arm, from your if you take and you wrap a cord around your arm, like rope, when I take an electrical cord and I'm wrapping it up around my arm or a rope, that's basically a cubit, each time it's, back and forth, it's a cubit. So, which I think is based on your hand to your elbow, But I don't make a megalithic yard doesn't seem to be that at all, especially when it breaks down into different other units too. And it's been all proven statistically,
And, so there is that suggestion of southern migrations, and you get other people who have said it was like I think it was the Turner site had occipital flattening. From their archaic period, and it was very similar to other archaic head skull deformation in like the Indian Knoll area. So there's some we're back to the indications of some patterns emerging over long distances, but your property seems more well known as exhibiting indications of people from the old world, and I think the ibex petroglyph seems to be some pretty convincing evidence that someone came to what's now New Hampshire after seeing this ibex animal running around in the Middle East or Africa or where it was indigenous to. Can you explain that artwork that's found in the Oracle Chamber.
Yeah, the Oracle Chamber, I mean, as you know, it's one of the largest chambers still on the site. And again, the whole site's orientated true north, south, east, west for the most part. The Oracle Chamber, if you look down at it from above, and you could remove the roof, you'd see it looks like either a Y, we used to call it the Y chamber. So it has an east-west part of it, a corridor, if you will, and then it has the north-south. The corridor, by the way, the west part of it's all Colville. You might remember in your visit from about 4 years ago. And that's where the deer carving's found. And I think Goodwin was the first one to report the deer carving. People probably saw it before that, but it's the first recorded, it was first recorded by Goodwin back around 1936 or 37. He was there in 36, and he started doing his research in 37. We probably can pin it down to actually, the year, if not a month, but he's the first one to report it. It looks like not a deer. The antlers really don't look like a deer, as you kind of mentioned. Then, so in the 60s or even a little bit earlier, maybe some people guessed it might be an ibex. An ibex I thought was African. It's actually a European animal, and they have a couple different varieties of them. And the ibex, if you Google it, the antler I think it looks a little bit like ours, but then the very tip of it kind of curves. It's the tip of the antler. But if you look up the Spanish ibex, it looks like our ibex carving. And so Dr. Barry Fell from Harvard University, he began looking at markings at our site back in 1975, and he, after studying the different markings that have been found, some in the 1960s and some before that, he identified Phoenician, Libyan, and Celtic markings. And according to his theory, that these markings originated out of Spain and Portugal, where the Phoenicians had gone in there. The Libyans from Libya had gone up there. You had the Iberians there, and you had the Celts there too. It was like a melting pot, he said, of different cultures, and they would have eventually, some of them would have been multilingual, possibly coming over on a ship to the New World, using it as a stepping stone, like Columbus did, And so I thought they were Iberian, and it's almost the same latitude as our site, so Portugal and Spain. And so the ibex seems to, when I checked that years ago, I saw the ibex. I said, yeah, it looks a little bit like, when I looked at the Spanish ibex, it looks just like the antler on that. And again, I don't know if Barry Fell made that correlation. He died in 1994. But he did look at inscriptions from North America, Central and South America, and he found Phoenician all the way from Maine all the way down to Brazil. And again, Celtic across New England as far west as the Milk River in Alberta, Canada, and other Libyan markings too, and then some other inscriptions from other cultures too in the New World that shouldn't really be here. In the academic community, sometimes they'll say they're all hoaxes, fakes, frauds, misinterpretations, ant tracks, glacial marks, that kind of thing. Almost any excuse, to avoid really trying to identify them objectively, But the oceans, we think, were used as highways, not barriers. And if you go back 60 years ago, the Vikings weren't legend, myth or whatever, that they came to the New World in their sagas, and some people even said, well, the sagas are inaccurate, or an inaccurate interpretation of them. They never came here. They went to Iceland, Greenland, and that's it. Today we know they came to Canada. The latest thought that they may have been coming over for 400 years now from Greenland, until Greenland was abandoned due to the little ice age that took place starting around the late 1300s. So, people would say, oh, there's no explorers before Columbus. So our feeling is that people came out of Europe, the Mediterranean, and Africa into the New World. And it's not conclusive. It's kind of an ongoing, research and trying to find evidence to prove it one way or the other, basically.
The St. Brendan voyage really captures my imagination too. That's a little off topic, but but since you do bring up other people, other mariners before Columbus, the descriptions that are in his chronicle do sound very plausible. That this 5th century Irish monk was taking the stepping stone route across the North Atlantic to Newfoundland, and if what you're saying is true, it's Brendan and the Vikings may have just been following what people had known for a long time.
And Columbus too, they say Columbus. He went to Bristol, England. He went to Galway, where Brendan, where Brendan. I went and visited that chapel where Columbus prayed at, and it's David Brody's new book. He'll be talking about that probably Sunday, but I was there with my dad, back in '83. Although it's been 35 years, and a little bit of the detail, I still remember going to it, And when I read David's book, it was interesting. I'm trying to think back to what my dad and I witnessed at the time. Maybe my photographs will show that chapel, I guess, and it was added on to later after St. Brendan's time. And but Columbus went there, and then Bristol, England, where mariners all over the world kind of came, and then into Ireland, and then he goes up to Iceland, And what would he be doing up there? Probably talking to the descendants of the Vikings who are still there today, as a matter of fact, trying to find out what these legendary lands are to the west, And according to one tale, it's a little different than Dave's book, just a little bit, is that he tries to go to Greenland, but the little ice age is upon him, and he says ship got covered with ice, and he decided that wasn't too wise to head that way. It would be very dangerous. Ship can capsize, but he decided a southerly route would be a better way to go to the west. And that's what he did eventually. So I never knew Columbus went up to that direction whatsoever. But his wife, I guess, he had a mistress and a wife, or two wives, and one of his wives was related to the St. Clairs, of the Sir Henry St. Clair family, and he may have come over into the States around 1398 as one of the legends, and that Westford Knight has what looks like a carving of a sword, and it might be a knight on it that's been weathered so badly it's kind of hard to make out some of the detail, but the sword is like, it's very, we have a copy of it in our museum, and that part of it I don't think is questionable. I mean, it looks like a pommel sword or whatever. You can see it very distinctly, and parts of the other part of it you can kind of make out, but it's kind of weathered, so because it was next to a road, the road salt gets on it for the last, I don't know how many years, but decades. It's caused damage to it, but the sword, you can still see it. So all these different early pre-Columbian, people coming over until the time of Columbus, it's something that we're kind of interested in. On the other side of the continent, too, coming in from across the Pacific, too, whether it's Polynesian or Australian. There's some evidence in DNA might support that in South America. And then, the Chinese coming into the West Coast, and certain pieces of artifacts like Chinese anchors, a wall that's in the Bay Area of San Francisco. There's a wall there that looks really interesting. That might be Chinese before Columbus. And some of the animals are looking like the hairless dog and the naked-necked chicken. And the Spanish reported these animals on the West Coast. They were some of the first Europeans in modern times to arrive there. And these animals, I believe, are from Asia. They're not from, so they didn't swim across the Pacific. Somebody must have brought them over.
Okay. Okay, let's... we've covered a lot of interesting evidence, and Dennis, you've also sent some photos of where you've had to straighten some walls that have started to tilt inward due to the earthquake tremors you have on the property. There is need to straighten the walls up to prevent further damage, and you get heat for doing stuff like that. So, look, they're just inventing history, and they're moving the stones around. Well, there are places like Göbekli Tepe that have braces to keep the horizontal stone on top of the pillar to keep the T shape, and maybe some of the braces are used to keep the stone from maybe falling apart if there's a big fissure in it. Barbara has photos of her grandfather at Stonehenge where there were support beams used for the lintel to support the lintel stones. So, when you undertake a project like the rebuilding, like the West Wall you did a couple years ago, what are you trying to accomplish with a project like that?
The west wall of the chamber ruins was in danger of eventually collapsing, and there's organic matter behind it on the west side of that wall. The wall runs north and south, and it was slowly starting to push the wall out because of frost action, settling, and, although we don't have the major earthquakes we do on the west coast, we do have earthquakes or tremors here. And I asked a geologist from Tufts, actually from the Western Observatory in Massachusetts, and he gets on TV quite often. He visited our site, and I said, "What's the difference between a quake and a tremor?" Because just magnitude, they're all the same. But you have them here because in the Ice Age we had about a mile of ice, and ever since then there's been isostatic changes in the Earth's level. It's slowly rebounding, if you will. You take a mile of ice off the Earth, it's going to come up like a sponge. So since the ice left sometime roughly 12,000 years ago, a little bit before that, the Earth has been rebounding. It's changed the landscape quite a bit. There are a couple of gigantic bodies of water in New England going out towards New York that are not there anymore. And they're just minor ponds now. And that's because the Earth has changed its level. Dams are broken, natural earthen dams. And so our landscape would look different than it would after the time of the glaciers or even 4,000 years ago. And that causes damage to the chambers. Any ancient site in the world, like you mentioned, Göbekli Tepe, I guess that's about 11,600 years old. They're going to suffer damage, both natural and man-made. So our attempt is to basically, we do preventative maintenance on the site. If we see something that could, result in the chamber failing, well, we don't want it to hurt our visitors, and we don't want the chamber to fall down. So we do have to do some of that at the site. It's kind of an ongoing, slow process. That was a little bit bigger project we did. It took many, many weeks, and had a couple of really nice people helping, including that archaeologist. She did all the sifting of the soil that came out of the excavations as we went down to do the wall restoration. And then we did measuring and, finding the plan of the structure looking more kind of a trapezoidal shape, and then the core belling and everything. Those are kind of results of that. But it's been going on since 1937 when Mr. Gooden purchased the site. And his basic thing was to any rock that was within 3 feet of a structure, to put it back on top and to sift the soil, look for artifacts. It was, again, for restoration, and eventually, we picked up the maintaining of the site. He died in 1950. My dad got involved with it in the mid-50s, and it's always been kind of an ongoing thing. But if you look at Newgrange in Ireland and you look at pictures from the early 60s, I was there in 1983, but you look at them and you're looking at 2 different structures almost, or Delft, which are in the same area. I've been to Athens, to the Parthenon, and that's been restored. But I haven't been to Egypt, but I've been to a lot of other places over there. But Egypt, the Sphinx, for instance, is another one that's undergone a lot of restoration, And as you mentioned, Mark, even in Ohio, some of the 10,000 mounds, a couple of them have been, I believe you said you named them too, have been basically completely rebuilt, you know.
Like the Site Mound in Mound City?
Yeah. Sure. And, you know, during the NEAR meeting this weekend, they, as part of my presentation, and Doug Schwartz, he was a wonderful help. He's the vice president of NEAR. He had quite a few photographs, and what he did is he showed them to the audience, and he goes, anyone want to guess where this picture was taken? And one of them was of Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon, and almost everybody just stared at it. They couldn't quite place it. I think a few of them almost guessed what it was. And, you know, the big D-shaped, you know, structure at Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon, I mean, that's, you know, it's amazing. When you look at the first photographs taken, it's like almost unrecognizable. And today it's like, holy cow, the National Park System did that. And then he showed some in Tikal and, you know, down in Mexico. He showed, I think, some in Honduras, some in the Mayan ruins. He might have shown Teotihuacan. I've been there too. But he showed some of them, and people had a hard time figuring out what they were looking at because of the amount of restoration work. And the point is, a lot of criticism on our side is, oh, look, you guys have, you know, when Goodwin dug it out, and then he did some restoration work on it, some modifications, you know. But Goodwin tried to keep it the original plan, you know, as much as possible. He wasn't up there to make things, as some people accused him of. And the reason we know that is because we have he wrote 3 books. There's pictures in his books, but Malcolm Pearson, who showed Goodwin the site in 1936, was a professional photographer. So we have photographs from the very first day and visit there. We have photographs of the site from 1935 before they visited. They were in like the Haverhill Gazette newspaper. And I also have 4 1920 photographs with dates on them of the site, different shots of different areas. And then one from, we believe it's around 1915 or 1916. So well before the time of Mr. Goodwin. So the point is, some people thought Goodwin built a lot of the site, really changed it. But if you look at the old photographs, and that was one of our objectives, is show people that not only does it happen at our site, which we get a lot of criticism for, but it happens at Stonehenge, you know. It happens at mounds, and then it happens out in some of the kivas and some of the structures in the southwest in the Four Corners area, you know, or over in Europe or even in the Middle East, you know. These sites do get rebuilt in some cases. And I've been to Chichen Itza down in Mexico, and they showed some pictures of that too. A lot of that's been restored, you know. You first look at it, you can hardly recognize it. And now, when they get the jungle off it and they restacked a lot of the stones and everything, it's like, oh, it didn't quite look like that when the first researchers began their work on the site, you know. So, but that's one of your things about how some of the criticism about our site, you know, being, you know, built and maybe it's fabricated and all that stuff, but that's not true.
Okay, and one of the things that really couldn't be fabricated is the probably frequently overlooked drains on the site. Can you explain those?
Yeah, actually, whoever built the site engineered a whole network of, we call them storm drains. They're actually, first it starts with a channel dug through the bedrock, and the channel can be like 3 or 4 inches wide and maybe an inch or so deep, and they run throughout the bedrock and quite often across the kind of the grain of the rock, if you will. And then what it does is it runs several feet, and it goes to an underground drain, and the underground part of it is basically 2 parallel walls that these people built, and then they put capstones, like almost building a miniature chamber. And the longest one is about 75 feet long, and I think the shortest one might be about maybe a dozen feet long. And I think there's about 12 of them on the site. There could be others we haven't found yet. But these really keep the bedrock dry. And 4,000 years ago, we believe the hilltop, from all the shovel test pits, a study went on from 91 to 1997 by that same person, the person that was president of the Hampshire Archaeological Society. After she got off the North Stone, she began doing these STPs, or shovel test pits. Basically, it's a square hole about 50 centimeters across. They go down to either bedrock or what they call a pre-occupational level, where no human activity would take place below this level, from what they can tell. You know, maybe hit glacial soil or something like that, or sand. Or anyway, they did something close to like 80 of them across the hilltop. And her husband was a doctor of geology at Tufts University for 30 years, so she had a really good resource in him about the geology. And she was looking for both geological and archaeological data. And what she said at the end of that was basically, geologically speaking, the hilltop was probably 75% bare, 25% covered with glacial soils and clay. And then later on, windblown soil came in, vegetation decay. You have about an inch every century of soil buildup after that, but it's not linear. It's very, very slow at first, and then you have more and more forest, and it accelerates a little bit. But at the same time, on the hill, we have erosion, a lot of, washing off the top of the hill from storms and when the snow melts and everything. So whoever built this site realized that the bedrock would not drain very well. They didn't have soil there to absorb the water or vegetation, so what they did is they created that whole network, and it works pretty well today. We haven't examined every drain, and it would kind of neat to send a little robot into them if you could, because some of them have silt in them. Because the ones they have looked at, they have found stone tools and other types of artifacts in these drains. They do collect things like at home when things fall into your sink, So an interesting thing about that, too, is when Goodwin first got there and began cleaning the site, within a short time they found these drains. They had blocks of stone blocking them, like plugs. It's almost like somebody shut the site down, winterized it, and went away, and never came back.
Okay, and you have other pieces of evidence about this abandoning the site. We probably need to talk about that. Do you know when this could have happened? Why? It just we've discussed that. Like, why would people just all of a sudden just stop what they're doing and depart the area?
So that's excuse me, my voice got a little sore. I apologize. We don't know. We do have the earliest carbon dating is going back, and it looks like a fire pit up near the North Stone. It doesn't date the wall or the North Stone itself, but it's in that area, and that dated to about 7,400 years old. So we have some sort of human activity, we think, building a campfire of some type on the hills. So that was very important to us. It's Middle Archaic time period. So maybe as early as almost 7,500 years ago, people were up there. And then when the site was built, we think around 4,000 years ago, because that's when the earliest carbon dating of the main site was. The main site, again, is a 1-acre area surrounded by that chain link fence. And that dated to 4,000 years. And the astronomical alignments worked 4,000 years, plus or minus a few hundred years. So when was the site abandoned is a great question. We have found these big slabs of stone that would become probably roof slabs. And you can see them in the oracle chamber and the other structures, too. There's very big, large, several-ton stones that were used on the roofs. In 1982, one of our workers was sitting on a rock having her picnic lunch, during lunchtime, and she and the rest of the staff had been advised by one of our researchers, Dr. David Stewart Smith, to look for stones that might have a little bit of shaping to it, or dressing, we call it. It's actually like a serrated edge on the stone where somebody, on the slabs, where somebody may have been striking it with a hammerstone, shaping the stone, and what will leave behind is kind of that serrated edge. And sure enough, she was sitting on the stone, and she also noticed it was kind of up from the bedrock, and there was a lot of dirt covering this, but you could tell the rock came up, from where it would have been originally. She looked under it, and there's a propping stone. The stone's about a foot across. It was artificially stuck under there after the stone was separated from the bedrock and raised. They actually propped it up. And this would give them a better angle to slam the edge of it with a hammerstone, and a technique called percussion flaking. So when she found that, she reported that to David. And the next year, he did an excavation in the front edge of that stone. And when they get down to the bedrock, they found all the little pieces of stone that had been struck off the front surface. Overseeing this was Dr. Gary Hume, the state archaeologist. And he said it's unmistakable that this percussion flaking technique was used on the stone in much the same way as an arrowhead would be shaped. So it's a Stone Age technology. But we have found, just in the last few years, we found probably We had known of a few of them like that one. We found a few more in the 80s, a few more in the 90s, but more recently we found many. And I think the number right now we have is about 33, and they're located all over the hilltop, some up to 1,000 feet from the main site. Some are just 4 or 5 feet across, and some are double or triple that length, weighing up to a couple tons, and they're all propped up. So it's not like they're just sitting on the ground and nature could have done. These have been artificially. And the bedrock is like an ice or schist. It does come up in layers. They call it foliation. It does come up, so you have to know how to break the stone away from its bedrock without shattering it. So these guys are pretty good at that. So they'd work a fissure or a crack in the bedrock, and somehow they were able to separate these big layers in the size and shape kind of what they want. And then they would do this hammer stoning on it to get a final shape to it. I thought they're going to bring these up to the main site perhaps because they have a roof. Most of them look like roof slabs. I think they had a bigger plan for our site. We thought maybe for many years the site was complete and eventually abandoned, but now we're thinking that maybe they had a bigger plan for the site and they just never came back. And where did they go and what happened to them, we don't know. But Mike, you do a lot of reading, you're well-read and everything. I mean, wherever you go in the world, it seems like whether it's the Mayans, although the Mayan people still exist today, a lot of the cities were abandoned, in North America, Central, South America, or even over the Old World. Some of these sites are like, what happened to the people, even Stonehenge, where did the people go, that used some of the 50,000 megalithic sites in Europe, they were abandoned at some point, And I bring up at this time that megalithic sites aren't just in Europe. I think they're on 6 continents out of 7. And the same thing happens, they were building these sites, and then the people eventually disappear from them. But in our case, it looks like they were still going to build it bigger. That was kind of like, oh, that's interesting, But they didn't.
Yeah, and you do get some of the archaic cultural traditions of site avoidance, like maybe like something bad happened there, and they just stopped using it as a ceremonial site. That's a reason. Seems like a major flood around the Poverty Point area that no longer made it accessible by boat, and it just fell out of disuse.
Right, I've heard also that's that one. That's interesting, yeah. And then other times, I think they can look at pollen samples and so forth and see there was a really bad drought, and so after a few years of that, maybe longer, people started getting very discouraged and very upset that they weren't getting the rain, the crops were failing, and then, whether it's like Cahokia or, mounds in Illinois, which is an amazing site. They call it America's Stonehenge. I was just watching a story on that recently. It's like, where did the people go? Why did they leave here? There might have been up to 50,000 people possibly supporting that place, from a distance around there, and the ones that live there. But, where did they go? Why? And one of the thoughts I heard on that particular site is people might have migrated up to Wisconsin and started all over again, at the Aztec mounds. But why would they abandon something they built that was so incredibly labor-intensive, and to move away from there, to do it all over again a few hundred miles up north perhaps, So with our site, and there are other New England sites, and Greater New England, actually probably about 800 sites they've located. Some of these may be related to our site in our time period from, let's say, eastern part of Canada and Quebec, all the way down through New England, New York, Pennsylvania. But I mentioned out in eastern Colorado they're finding several of the same features out there, which is quite interesting. And I think Dr. Little was talking about a 40-square-mile area of Alabama with these gigantic stone mounds, instead of earthen mounds, stone mounds with standing stones. He mentioned a couple of what we would call menhirs, and I think he called them obelisks, which either way, big tall stones. But he mentioned his rattlesnake walls, and I'm like, oh, rattlesnake walls. I think he's talking about what we call serpent walls, just a different word used. And I'm thinking, I got to get some pictures of that and see how they relate to ours in the Northeast or even the ones in Colorado, because this seems to be quite spread out, across the vast, area. Mr. Goodwin's time in the 1930s, he knew of about, and he lived in, during the 1940s he wrote the book, and that's where he lists 15 sites that he knew of in the Northeast, 15, and just New England, not realizing they were outside of New England, and that there may actually be hundreds and hundreds of these sites, and there are some that look similar, some of the features as far west as Colorado and down in Alabama. So maybe other states have these things we just haven't heard of too.
Right, and you were talking about this ceremonial center was poised to be expanded into an even greater center. Who knows? There was a lot of quarrying going on, and they, it seemed like they had a plan. But do you have any plans to acquire any more property in the hopes of finding something else associated with the site? What are your plans for the property?
Yeah, we have about almost 110 acres, and when my dad got involved, I think there were I'm going to say 20 acres, I think, that Mr. Goodwin purchased, and it went to Malcolm Pearson when Mr. Goodwin died, and then my dad opened the site up in 1958, and he leased the property from Malcolm for, I think, a 3-year period, and then he had it on a yearly period for another 2 years. So I think it was by 1963 he raised enough capital to purchase that, and then he began buying more land, because he knew the hill was not just 20 acres. He knew the entire hill might be, he knew of the walls out there, and because there's a couple satellite, like the Watch House Chamber that's located 400 feet from the main site, and a couple other features up there, but he wanted to protect the entire hill, and it was a good thing, because if homes had gone up, instead of watching the sunset over the winter solstice monolith, which is pretty spectacular when you watch it, you'd be looking at a house there, or the summer or whatever. So, and then he actually went out and he bought what we called at the time the Indian Cliff or Native American Cliff shelter, and that's where we found pottery in 1958 that dated to Middle Woodland period, around 2,500 years, perhaps, maybe a little towards between 2,000 and 2,500 years. In the 1990s, during one of those shovel test pits, they found a wigwam site down by a parking lot. It was about 30 feet across, post moles, because the wood that supported the structure actually rotted in the ground and left a big ring. And in that, they found 2 fire pits, and they actually found grease still in the soil that hadn't decomposed after. The one carbon dating said 2,000 years old from the fire pit, and the other fire pit was 1,700 years old. On the other side of the parking lot, about 150 feet away maybe, they found a drying rack, 2 more post moles, and a fire pit. And they had run out of money to do the carbon dating on that fire pit, so the charcoal, I think, is still sitting there for 20 years, And that was, again, done by, she was president of the Hampshire Archaeological Society at the time. So that was probably a winter camp there, sheltered from the hill. And on the other side, we have the summer camp where the Native Americans would go underneath. But this is about 2,000 years after the site was built. The Native Americans were right around the whole site. What involvement did they have with the site? How much? How little? We really don't know the story at all, But as far as buying any more land, I think it'd be really nice, but the land, my dad got up to about 110 acres. There's homes all around it. We bought 2 acres in 1985, put a house up in 86, and my son lives next to us on 2 more acres. This land abuts this property, so we're protecting that with our homes too, I guess. But on the other side is the development. They're really nice homes kind of around here, like 2 acres of land each. But on the other side, there's a farm, and that's just recently been 60 acres, I believe, has been cut just about in half, and they're subdividing that into homes. That's on the opposite side from us. I don't know what's going to happen next to us. We're about to have the farm there and do a B&B or something like that where, people can come and stay, and have the historical part of it, But it's a little beyond our financial means, so Right now we got all we can handle. But the problem is throughout the Northeast, a few of these chambers have been destroyed recently. Our site, is protected by us for 60 years now. And before that, Malcolm, before that Goodwin, and it's the other sites in New England and elsewhere outside of New England you have to kind of worry about, and hopefully ours will always remain the way it is, And we are a state historic site. We made that in 1970, but the state doesn't own it nor control it. We pay our taxes like everybody. We're not, we don't receive tax. We pay tax money. We depend on people visiting us to keep the place going after, 60 years. I had to work full-time as an airline pilot. I did that for 35 years. My dad was an AT&T engineer for 30 years. My son's an engineer. I'm surrounded with engineers. But anyway, so, yeah, I hope the other sites around will be. There have been a couple of them that have been given to the town by some builders recently, one in Danville, New Hampshire, one in Raymond, New Hampshire, that Goodwin actually worked on, the one up in Raymond. So we're hoping more that will happen, even if it's like a half an acre, just to protect the site, That would be nice. They put homes up, but if they can protect that particular structure from the bulldozer, that would be kind of nice, So.
Right. And speaking of, you are a private business, if people want to learn more about your opening times and see the photos of the alpacas and everything else you have going on at the location. You have a website, StonehengeUSA.com, that people can visit, and you also have a new app that you have available. Do you want to describe that?
Yeah, you're right, Michael. You have a website. We've had that for over 20 years. And you're right, StonehengeUSA.com. And if you send us messages, there's an email address there and a phone number, too. We have a Facebook page, too, and I think we have almost 9,000 followers of people want to Facebook us. And then we have links on there, too, like NERA, that group, research group, and then other places that, are doing kind of like ancient sites, different sites like that. But, yeah, we did a new app starting in June and on Android or Apple, and you can download it. It's America's Stonehenge. It's America's, not American. It's apostrophe S. People put American in there. It doesn't work, but America's Stonehenge, and it has both audio, it has pictures, and it has text. And you can actually do, a virtual tour sort of in your easy or lazy boy chair anywhere in the world. And we had a company, organization, I should say, came up and did 360 shots of our site back, I think about 2 or 3 months ago. They did a really nice job. And those 360s inside the chambers and outside will eventually go onto that app. But the app, people say right now, the software will have to be changed, which is an ongoing process. And so the future looks good on that, maybe in a year or so. We're ready to load it on there. It's just when they have it ready for us. So you can not only just take, regular, it's good. We got a lot of really nice photographs, but you'll be able to screen and then do 360 and, look all around inside the oracle chamber, some of the other structures, and maybe the alpacas, and stuff like that. You're able to, and then probably you can do a museum too, be able to look around inside that, see the, some of the displays we have in there, dioramas and stuff like that. So, yeah, that's something new. We decided everybody seems to like it, so it's working out pretty well so far.
Okay, and next month, of course, you have the winter solstice. But is there anything coming up between today and the winter solstice and like the cross quarter day or something like that? One of the meteor showers. Do you have like a special event going on?
Actually, we just had the cross quarter day. It's actually in today's calendar they moved them all to like the cross quarter days or the mid-season days, so like August 1st, November 1st, February 1st. Which one am I missing? I think I hit them all. February. Yeah. So these, but in ancient times, they're actually a few days later. and with the Earth's tilt. So you actually have to watch our cross-quarter day, like November 1st. You have to actually go over around November 7th to make it work, not only due to the Earth's tilt, but they actually celebrated it a little bit later. Modern calendars, I guess they moved it to the 1st of each month to make it kind of nice, you know. Some of our holidays have done that too. I think, I was just thinking Columbus Day, was it Columbus? Somebody's going to move one of the holidays around so it's on the 1st. I'm trying to think. They're actually trying to change the law on that for convenience sake, so I forget how they want to do it. But so anyway, December 21st or 20th, I think it is, will be the winter solstice. And 50 years ago, we had 1967 started clearing out that winter solstice sunset alignment, but the weather did not cooperate on that day back in 67. So 50 years ago, on December, we went up and looked at it. Same thing, the weather was bad for a couple of days because you could come a couple of days on either side of it. It worked fine. And then in 69, the same thing. But 1970, we're getting pretty close to our 50th anniversary where we actually watched, 4 of us went up there, and we actually watched the sunset. I was there that day. I was probably about 16 years old, and my dad and one of our young assistant managers and my neighbor, we all went up there. It was about a foot of snow we had to get through to get up there. And that's the picture in the front of my dad's book, and my dad made a painting of that. And when it happened, we said, we're probably the first people. It's kind of a neat, you know, chills went over. It's like we might be the first people watching this, you know, for perhaps thousands of years, you know. It was pretty cool. And so, and I guess in 2 years we'll have to celebrate that 50th, that particular 50th anniversary.
Okay, and you know, what is a cross-quarter day? You know, like, was it, you know, semi-serious holiday that you know, if it's recorded, you know, what did other cultures do for, you know, these types of holidays?
So we have the 4 seasons everybody knows about, but the cross-quarter days or the mid-season days are actually it's said like the mid-season. They're between those seasons actually, and it divides the year into like, you know, at least 8 parts. So the next after winter solstice, the next cross-quarter day will be February, and it was called Imbolc by the Celts, and it's right around, you know, Groundhog's Day as well as Candlemas, and it's actually and it will sound funny to some people. It was actually supposed to be the end of winter. You wouldn't know that up here in New England, that's for sure. But it's supposed to be the beginning of spring. And then March 20th would be mid-spring, and we call it the first day of spring, but it would be the mid-spring. And then the end of spring would be May Day. And by the ancient Celts, it was Beltane or Beeltena, the fires of Beltane. And that was beginning of summer. And then by the time you get to June, you'd have the June 20th or 21st, depending on the year. It would be the summer solstice, but they call it the midsummer, not the first day of summer, but the midsummer solstice. And they had a Gaelic name for that. And then it went to August 1st, which is called Lammas, and there's Loch Nasser or something like that. There's a couple of different pronunciations, but the end of summer, the beginning of fall, getting ready to harvest the crops. By September, you have the equinox or the mid-equinox, and then you get to November 1st, which is the day after Halloween, All Saints Day or All Souls Day, and it's called Samhain. It looks like Samhain, but Samhain. Now you're getting back to the beginning of winter and the end of fall, and, you know, they should have had the harvest by then. And then you're into the winter solstice, midwinter solstice as it's been. So that causes a little confusion among people, but that's what these cross-quarter, and they're actually celebrated in a bigger way than the seasons were by the ancient Celts. I visited Mesa Verde in 1990. When I got out there, they have astronomical alignments, and I was quite surprised that they had the cross-quarter days because I had read up on it a little bit before I got out there, and I didn't realize that. And I got there, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. They were celebrating it. And I guess it would make sense to some people, you know, dividing year into smaller parts, you know. Or it could be where people were sharing ideas, too, across the landscape, you know. Those are some of the arguments, you know, whether some of these things are exchanged between peoples or just independent invention, you know. But Cahokia Mound State Park, you know, in Illinois, that also has a wooden circle, much like the one near Stonehenge called Woodhenge. And so it's called America's Woodhenge. And there are 120 pyramids there at Cahokia, and I was there in 1991, I think. It's an amazing place. But that had the cross quarter and quarter. Some of the sites, as you know, Mark, like I think Newark Bounds in Ohio, are kind of geared more towards the lunar alignments, the lunar standstills. But our site seems to have everything. It's got the mid-season, it's got the season, it's got the lunar minors and lunar majors, which the next one comes up, I believe, in 2024, although I saw a show tonight on PBS that said 2025, so I got to get down and get the actual date on that. But every 18 and a half years we have the lunar minors, and 9 years later we have the majors, and so it's an 18 and a half year total cycle. So it's either the end of 24, beginning of 25. We hope to open up our forest. One of the things we want to do is do forest management up there, harvest the forest. We talked to the University of New Hampshire Forest Extension Service. They've been there a couple times, and they kind of point out we should go to the get a licensed forester, and the next step is to get a good logging company that will be under who foresters, who'll be supervising it, and they'll remove a lot of the trees on the alignments so you can see the alignments better, but we have never opened up the lunar major standstills north and south. They've never been open in over 50 years. So that will be something new, and we should have it done next winter when the ground's frozen. Come up there, and they do quite a nice job. They did a part of Stonehenge, Connecticut was done, I guess, North Stonington. And some of the members from the area have seen what they did, and they right next to some of the chambers and walls and standing stones, and they did a magnificent job. It came out looking beautiful. And what you don't want is trees falling on your structures. You don't want trees falling on the walls, the cons, or any of that. Plus the uprooting part of it, when the tree uproots, it can cause heavy damage to some of these structures too. So that's part of our intent, is to make the forest healthier. We were told that years ago to thin it out, and also the animals love it better. So it's good on all accounts, and it will be kind of a fire reduction thing too. With all the fires like out in California, it helps to reduce the fuel. It's called the fuel reduction thing too. But it will be a healthy forest, and you'll be able to see the alignments. You'll be able to see the wall patterns, the Serpentine Walls. You send the drone up now, and you can see it okay. We've had a gentleman that's from the West Coast. He's moved out here, and he's got very expensive equipment he's been using. He travels all over the world with it, but he's been doing us really nice work for us. And he has a thermal imaging camera that's about $13,000. He's got a new piece of equipment he's going to be bringing down shortly once all the leaves are off the trees, and he has a high-definition color. And he puts all these images together, and the computer software is kind of expensive to rent. You have to rent it, I guess, by the month. According to him, it's like, whatever, it's several $100s a month or something. But anyway, you rent that, and he puts it through there, and then you come up with a 3D image by combining all the pictures, a really nice 3D map, about 1 square mile of our hilltop. And he said, under ideal conditions, you can see about 18 inches into the soil. So if there's anything hidden underneath the ground, any kind of, maybe kind of large features that we can't see when you're just walking around, they may show up with this, using this, his aerial images,
Okay. Dennis, you've been going into a lot of detail about all the cross-quarter days and equinoxes and solstices are all built into the positioning of the stones all across the hilltop. It seems pretty obvious that your property served as a calendar. Is there any other kind of reason why this ceremonial site was built there? Were there homes built around it? Was it also a village? What was the purpose of this site?
Well, the site, we think, is not a habitat site. We think it's where people. It's on a hill, kind of higher up to the heavens and God or gods. Like a lot of the megalithic sites in Europe, and as I mentioned, they go on 6 out of 7 continents. There's like 100,000 in Korea alone. But they see a lot of them seem to be built sometimes they're near waterways, near streams, brooks, that kind of thing. We're near the Spigot River on one side, and the Merrimack River is only a couple miles from here where you can navigate from the ocean right up to about 4 miles. We've heard a criticism, well, you're so far from the ocean. That if somebody crossed the ocean and went 2,500 miles or further to our shores, they'd only be 20 miles from our site. But if you follow the Merrimack River up, you're coming within about 4 miles of our site. 4,000 years ago, between here and the Merrimack, swamps and water and everything, we've had maps drawn up, and the gentleman that was doing it was from Harvard University, and he was kind of collaborating a little. Well, he was talking to people at the USGS in New Hampshire, which covers New Hampshire and Vermont, and talking about water levels going back in time and getting as much information as he could from these people up there. And it looks like you could come about a mile or two from the site by water if you're an ocean-going, people. And we know Native Americans use the waters for highways too, So the question is, why would they choose our particular hill? It does have an earthquake fault line running through it. If you go back to the old world, 600 or roughly 600 stone circles in Wales made by ancient man in England are located on or near a fault line. It's just a repeating pattern over there. Over here, we find a lot of our New England site, chambers are located near faults also. Ours is visible. You can actually see the whole thing. The whole hill has been cracked in half. And it's a branch of the Clinton-Newbury fault line that runs off the coast of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and I believe it swings right down into Connecticut. It's a dormant kind of, but even though it's dormant, it's been dormant for a long time, it still gets moved when we have earthquakes. They actually took advantage of that crack through the entire hill to actually remove some of the bedrock slabs for building purposes. One of them is a 14-ton roof slab that came from, you can see where it came out of right next to the fault. And the hills around our site are about a half a degree above, a little bit higher, about a half a degree. And it makes for a nice sunrise and sunset, moonrise and moonset. And as opposed to when you're looking at something flat like the ocean, you look at the sun, it's beautiful, but it's very big and distorted. Or the moon, they're very beautiful. But this makes them, when they're about a half a degree up above the horizon or before sunset or before just after sunrise, they're sharper, smaller, and you have a more accurate alignment. Plus stars also, only a couple stars that can actually rise or set on the horizon due to the atmosphere absorbing the sunlight. They call it extinction. So if you have a little bit of an uplook, you can see a star, more stars actually touch the horizon. There's only a couple of them that can do it, even with a half a degree uplook. But you could actually watch it. There's a part of that Harvard Smithsonian report said in 1978, when we get it back, was about when the stones were erected. But it also said you have 24 star alignments, and that's something they didn't identify with us, and we still have to do further research on that, because I think that's exciting. If we can get more, somebody in there that really wants to get involved with the astronomy again, maybe we can find out what some of these other standing stones are up there. We have a couple of them we haven't identified what they're pointed towards. But that report said you have about 24 star alignments. We knew of the North Star, so that's one of them. So 23 more actually. So it's
Dennis, for those people that don't know what you've got there, it's an amazing site. You've got chambers, you've got stone alignments, you've got walls, you've got so many different exhibits, so to speak, and so many people, they hear American Stonehenge and all they can think of is the one in England. And what you have there is so much more. Plus, you've got an amazing visitor center. But it's a small area, but there's so much packed into it. It's absolutely worth the time and the energy to go see, because it's an educational experience beyond anything I can imagine. I can't imagine anything else in this country. Well, maybe Serpent Mound and stuff like that, but where you can walk through and you can see and you can go through these chambers in some places and get a feeling for what it must have been like to be back 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 years when this was home. I mean, I realize it wasn't home for people, but in many cases it was something that was very familiar to people, even if it was just ceremonial. And to feel the intensity and the energy that went into the building and the creation of this, and then the utilization of it for so very, very, very many years until they went away.
No, that's a great. That's a wonderful thing. The kind of description of it. And I think it's kind of like our site's kind of like a. I'm trying to think of this now. It's more like a Reader's Digest kind of a thing on our 110 acres. You look at a place like Stonehenge with 35,000 acres, and these things are just all over that 8,000 features, and then stretching across, Gunjiwamp in Connecticut, which we're not really sure if that site's a little bit newer, more later, but it has some interesting features, a couple of chambers that look like ours, but all over the landscape. These in Putnam County and Westchester County, New York, have over 200 down near the Hudson River area.
Oh,
but,
yeah.
Our site's compact, like in 110 acres we have. And I was brought to my attention by other people going, you've got pretty much everything here. It's all kind of close together. You go elsewhere around the Northeast, you have these same features that are spread out over the landscape, and that's still pretty cool. But you do a little bit more walking to get to some of these, especially like North Stonehenge, which to me is an amazing place, but spread out,
Well, Gunjiwamp, you have to have hiking shoes, and it is a labor of love to trek through that area. I know that I was just praying for a trail, and there wasn't one. And there may be now. It was going back 10 years or so, but it was a laborious hike to get to all of the places at Gunjiwamp. And at your site, it's good for older people, it's good for children, it's good for any age group, and it's educational. I mean, kids don't get to see stuff like this. I mean,
we kind of go we go for the Ice Age right up to the historic. We talk about all those.
Yeah.
These are, and then recently we got a 6-inch wood chipper, so we covered all the trails with all the. I burn mostly firewood, but the junk I do into the wood chipper, and we had an old wood chipper before, but I covered every trail with bark mulch, and it looks not only nice and it's nice to walk on, but it keeps away the little any kind of insects and those bad, ticks. It's supposed to be good for all of that, for all that wildlife. But we do have a lot of nice wildlife up there. You have deer and turkeys and, red-tailed hawks and all of that. So you get to see all of that, and bunny rabbits everywhere, and squirrels and chipmunks. They love the area up there, so it's kind of a wildlife. And we have the alpacas, too, We have 5 alpacas on display. And, that thing, too, the alpacas are part of the, their ancestors were indigenous to North America for about 45 million years, so we discussed that, too, They were about the size of a bunny rabbit, and then they lived here for 45 million years up to about maybe 8,000 years ago. They found some more remains in California, Mesa, Arizona, in a Walmart parking lot that dated to about 8,000 years. So their ancestors were here, and then they migrated through Alaska, Bering Strait, and down through Panama about 2 or 3 million years ago. But people go, oh, yeah, they're from over there. I'm like, no, actually they were here, and then they migrated, and then they became extinct here. So these guys' ancestors are actually from our continent, Canada, U.S., and I guess part of Mexico, They're from, and that brings up a whole thing about, what animals were here in the past, going back. So that's kind of part of our history, too.
And I remember when we did go, you actually had an Indian sacred circle there as well. Is that still there?
Yeah, we've had. Yeah, I've tried. If it's the one, we have the one where Katja, she does her celebration. She'll be up for the winter solstice. We'll be open for that. If the weather's good, she'll definitely be here. She's from Petersham, Mass, and she actually has some chambers in her backyard. My dad even used to have pictures of those in 1960s when we went to some of the near meetings back then. I remember seeing slides on, different sites, and that was one site. Those were in her backyard. But, we've had different Native Americans, even from Mexico. A Mayan healing doctor has done a thing, Peruvian medicine man, and Paula Underwood. She was Iroquois. She came to our site and did a circle at our site, She's been twice. She passed away, but she wrote The Walking People, a really thick book of about 10,000 years of her family's ancestry, Yeah, it was really interesting, too. But, yeah, so we've had the Native Americans come to the site, they kind of express an interest. They probably know, we don't really know all the things about the site, for sure, we're still learning, but they kind of respect it, We did the Indian medicine wheels out in Wyoming, And they leave little offerings on the fence around the whole, it's like 9,000-foot elevation, and it's an incredible astronomical and ceremonial place. And you see all the offerings that are left around the chain link fence. Sometimes we find that we find flowers and stuff left behind by different people, of all different backgrounds, up there, which is kind of neat, especially on the solstices and equinoxes and some cross-border days, I go up there and say, there's flowers over there, So it's kind of nice, It's kind of I think they're showing their respect, and it's kind of cool. It looks nice. So.
Yeah, I just you kept mentioning cross-quarter days. Can you kind of explain what they are for those people who don't know?
Yeah, those are, as I was mentioning, those are like the August 1st, November 1st, May 1st, and if I didn't say February 1st, and they kind of divide the year into 4 more parts. But those are the beginning of they call them the mid-season. Those are what's actually the beginning of each season. So May Day is the beginning of summer, August 1st is the beginning of fall, November 1st is the beginning of winter, and February 1st is the beginning of spring. Just a little bit different than we think, We used to say, December 21st is the beginning of winter, but you might have also read before they call it midwinter solstice or midsummer solstice. How can it be the beginning of summer or winter if it's mid? That's because those cross-quarter days are the beginning. And they were more important to people like the Celts, and perhaps the Native Americans too, but I know the Celts for sure because there was a bigger festivities on those days than it was on these seasons, like summer solstice. They were celebrated too, but I guess they weren't as big a deal for some reason. I don't know. That's the history I've read on those, And they all have Celtic names, and I'm sure that other cultures had names for these days too. So we celebrate those too at our museum, So we don't get as many people turn out for those cross-quarter days. It's usually the seasons. We get most of our visitors that want to see that because they're more familiar with that, I think. But, the Stonehenge has that too. Stonehenge has those alignments, the cross-quarter days, the quarter days, the seasons, and then the lunar standstills too. So we have what Stonehenge basically have, including our true north-south alignment. And in star alignments we have, and I've read so much about Stonehenge, I don't recall any star alignments, or even any with Venus, but other cultures did look at that, Venus or the Pleiades, some of the constellations. Very, very important. The different cultures did sometimes a little different thing, on that.
Okay. Hey, Dennis, we have approaching 3 minutes left, and you are hoping to get your book out soon. And if you want to give out any of your websites or any other information, what's the status of your book, and and kind of start winding down the show, and hopefully within the next few minutes, Barbara's not going to fire me.
Okay, yeah, because it's kind of like, I know I don't want to have that King Tut's curse on you, or something like that. So hopefully by tomorrow, hopefully the next email I get from you tomorrow is not what I saw, before, If I don't hear from you, I might think the wrong thing too. If I don't hear from you again, I'll know what happened. But so they can reach us, we have a phone number on our website, StonehengeUSA.com, email address is on there too. And then we have the app, which is really good. Go into the app and you can actually tour our site that way, which is really good. And Facebook's a really good way too. Like I mentioned, I think we have like 9,000 Facebook. It's easy to put something on there real quick, and so we'll be celebrating the winter solstice, and we're going to continue with our research at our museum and anything that. Actually, this week we're going to be doing some more, I believe, excavations. So in this cold weather, she goes to Florida for the winter. I think she's leaving in another couple of weeks. But this week, I think the temperatures are going to be close to freezing. But she's still intending to come up Thursday and Friday this week, I think. We'll see what happens. I hope she does. So because it's going to be rather difficult to dig when everything's frozen in the ground, I think. So hopefully it warms up for her. And then we wouldn't see her until probably next May, if she goes, if this doesn't happen this week. So we're hoping to maybe get in. What she's looking for, actually, is a habitat site. It's away from the main site. It's outside that big 2,500-foot Serpentine Wall. We don't think people lived in the main site. Again, we think it's more of a ritual area, and it was sacred, so they would not contaminate it by living on it. They would live outside of that. And so she did find, 1991, she found a workshop and found different types of material that came from the North Shore of Boston, actually. It was imported to our hill, and they're making tools. And she wants to get back into that area and see if she can, actually locate some sort of a habitat, if you would, where they were actually living. So that's been her last 2 months she's been doing that. So hopefully she can discover it.
Hey, Dennis, I'm so sorry, but we are out of time.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you and Mark and both of you. Thank you so much, and your audience, too. Thank you so much for having me on this evening. I look forward